Caiaphas, a name that echoes through the centuries, is perhaps one of the most intriguing and controversial characters in the biblical narrative. For some, he is a ruthless villain. For others, a key player in divine designs. He was the high priest of Jerusalem at a time of intense religious and political conflicts. Imagine living in a period where every decision could ignite a revolt or shape history forever. The man who occupied this position not only had spiritual authority, but he was also the intermediary between the Jews and Roman power. Now click like, subscribe to the channel. It will only take a second, and you will help us a lot. Jerusalem in the 1st century after Christ was a seething cauldron of messianic cultures, ideologies, and expectations. Under the imposing shadow of the temple, Caiaphas not only led, but attempted to balance internal and external forces. It was a time of strict Pharisees, pragmatic Sadducees, and revolutionary zealots. The people expected a Messiah who would free Israel, but for Caiaphas, keeping peace with the Romans was a priority. In the midst of this scenario, he faced the biggest challenge of his life, dealing with the figure of Jesus of Nazareth. As high priest, Caiaphas held the power to interpret God's laws, but he also faced pressure from Caesar, the emperor of Rome. His position, more than a privilege, was an overwhelming responsibility. His every word could determine life or death, and his every gesture was closely watched. He was the man who had everything to lose, but who believed he was protecting his nation. However, history would show us that his vision was perhaps too narrow for the plans of such a vast God. And so, the figure of Caiaphas leads us to an inevitable question. Was he just an ambitious villain, or a tragic leader trapped in a game much bigger than himself? The answer, perhaps, is hidden in the details of his actions and the consequences that shaped not only his life, but the entire history of Christianity. Caiaphas was not born into a prestigious position, but his lineage favored him. As the son-in-law of Annas, an influential former high priest, he had access to a network of power and influence that few could imagine. In the Sanhedrin, the supreme council of the Jews, alliances were built like a chessboard. Every move was meticulously calculated, and Caiaphas proved to be a skilled player. His ability to navigate religious and political leaders was what earned him the title of high priest, one of the highest in Jewish society at the time. However, this rise did not come without challenges. The Sanhedrin, composed of Pharisees and Sadducees, was an arena for fervent debate. The Pharisees were strict keepers of the law, while the Sadducees, like Caiaphas, had a more practical approach, often in line with the Romans. To survive in this environment, it was necessary to be more than a religious leader. You had to be a strategist, diplomat, and sometimes even a conspirator. Caiaphas not only adapted, but prospered, securing his position for nearly 20 years, a rare feat at that time. Caiaphas's relationship with Rome was also a crucial factor in his rise. At a time when Judea was a province under occupation, maintaining an alliance with Roman power was essential to remain in office. While other priests fell for trying to defy imperial orders, Caiaphas knew how to stand up. It offered stability, something the Romans valued above all else, and in return, he received the support he needed to govern. But at what cost? This connection to Rome not only gave him power, but also placed him in a vulnerable position before his own people. And so, Caiaphas established himself as a pillar of Jewish authority, a man who seemed unshakable. But, like any edifice built on fragile alliances, its position would be tested. The encounter with Jesus of Nazareth would not only be a spiritual challenge, but a political earthquake that would shake the foundations of his power. Caiaphas's time was marked by almost palpable tension. Jerusalem was at the center of a scenario of ideological, spiritual, and political conflicts. The Jewish people lived under Roman rule, a force that brought order, but at the cost of freedom. While Caesar ruled with an iron fist, the Sanhedrin tried to balance the demands of a people thirsty for independence with the orders imposed by the empire. It was a dangerous game, where any mistake could result in revolts, or worse, the destruction of the entire nation. Internal divisions also contributed to the chaos. Pharisees, with their devotion to the law, saw the temple as a sacred place to be protected. The Sadducees, pragmatic, sought to reconcile their faith with political demands. And there were the Zealots, who whispered revolt and acted like sparks in a powder keg. In the midst of this, Caiaphas found himself between extremes: a people waiting for a divine liberator and an empire that crushed any sign of rebellion. He knew that his leadership would not only be judged by God, but also by Caesar. In this context, Jesus of Nazareth emerges, a figure who challenged the status quo and inflamed hearts. To the people, he was the answer to their prayers. For religious leaders, a threat to the delicate balance that sustained peace. His teachings not only confronted traditions, but also put the power of those in authority at risk. And Caiaphas, as high priest, carried the burden of protecting stability, even if it meant sacrificing an innocent. With Jesus gaining followers and his message echoing in the city's darkest corners, Caiaphas knew a crisis was inevitable. Every step he took was like walking a tightrope, with the temple on one side and Rome on the other. But did he understand the magnitude of the events that were to come? Or was he just a man trying to prevent the collapse of his world? The arrival of Jesus of Nazareth was like a hurricane in the controlled world of Caiaphas. The high priest had dealt with dissidents and preachers before, but Jesus was different. His message touched the marginalized, challenged the powerful, and brought a new understanding of God. He spoke with authority, healed the sick, and declared that the kingdom of God was at hand. For the Sanhedrin, his growing popularity was a real danger. For Caiaphas, he was a risk to the fragile stability he had fought so hard to maintain. The breaking point came with the purification of the temple. Jesus, in expelling the traders and money changers, tapped into the religious leaders' greatest source of power and control. The temple was not just a sacred place, it was the economic and political heart of Jerusalem. When he declared that the house of God had become a den of thieves, he put Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin against the wall. How could they allow a simple man from Galilee to challenge their authority in the very center of their influence? But it wasn't just Jesus' power that worried Caiaphas. It was his revolutionary vision. While many expected a Messiah who would lead a revolt against Rome, Jesus spoke of loving enemies, forgiving sins, and seeking God's justice above all else. For the people, this was liberating. To religious leaders, it was incomprehensible. Caiaphas knew he needed to act quickly before Rome noticed the growing unrest and punished everyone. He was faced with a choice: protect peace or give in to the transformation that Jesus proposed. And so, Caiaphas began to devise a plan to stop Jesus. It was not just a question of authority, but of survival. However, did he understand that his actions would be part of something much bigger? Or was he just another leader trying to protect what he believed was right, without realizing he was up against God's own plan? The plan to stop Jesus could not be something open or impulsive. Caiaphas knew that any mistake could turn the people into an angry mob, and the presence of Rome was a constant shadow over his shoulders. It was in this moment of tension that an unexpected opportunity arose. Judas Iscariot, one of Jesus' own disciples, offered to betray him. It was no coincidence, but a masterstroke in the intricate web of conspiracies that permeated the Sanhedrin. Judas brought with him something no one else could: direct access. He knew where Jesus would be. He knew the moments of vulnerability, and his betrayal offered the chance of a quiet capture. Caiaphas, always pragmatic, realized that this was the perfect solution to the dilemma he faced. The Sanhedrin meeting turned into a grim negotiation, where silver coins exchanged hands as a symbol of the price of a life. But why Judas? Why one of those closest to Jesus? This is a curiosity of history that continues to intrigue scholars and theologians. Maybe it was deception, maybe it was greed, or maybe something much deeper. For Caiaphas, however, Judas's motivations were irrelevant. What mattered was the outcome. The self-proclaimed Messiah would be delivered, and the chaos he represented could be silenced before it spread. And so, with the plan in motion, Caiaphas prepared the Sanhedrin for a trial that would define not only the fate of Jesus, but also the course of history. However, did he understand the weight of the consequences that would come? Or did you believe that everything would end with a simple execution? The night was heavy, shrouded in darkness that seemed to reflect the gravity of the events unfolding. Jesus, captured in Gethsemane, was rushed to the Sanhedrin, where Caiaphas was waiting. The rush was deliberate. The trial needed to be quick and away from the eyes of the crowd. It was a cunning maneuver, but also illegal, as Jewish law prohibited night trials. For Caiaphas, however, urgency justified any violation. He knew he was dealing with something that would transcend the limits of his own authority. The accusations were thrown like stones: blasphemy, incitement to revolt, threat to the temple. Witnesses were brought to testify against Jesus, but their stories were inconsistent, as if truth itself resisted manipulation. Caiaphas, with all his experience, realized that he needed something more solid. It was then that he asked the question that would change everything: "Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" When Jesus responded in the affirmative, Caiaphas tore his clothes in a theatrical gesture, declaring that there was no need for further proof. It was a tension-filled scene, almost theatrical in its execution. Caiaphas had gotten what he wanted, a statement he could use to justify condemning Jesus. But there was something about that answer that seemed to resonate beyond judgment. It wasn't just a confession. It was a direct challenge to the authority of Caiaphas, an assertion that the kingdom of God was above any human structure. In the silence that followed, it was impossible not to feel the weight of the moment. With the sentence defined, the next step was clear: taking Jesus to Pilate. For Caiaphas, the Roman governor would be the necessary instrument to execute the verdict. But did he really believe he was in control? Or deep down, was he beginning to realize that he was facing something much bigger than he could understand? At dawn, the Sanhedrin led Jesus to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, a man whose position was constantly threatened by the tensions in Judea. Caiaphas knew exactly how to approach the situation. To convince Pilate to condemn Jesus, he needed something more than religious accusations. It was necessary to transform them into a political problem. Thus, he presented Jesus as a threat to Roman rule, an agitator who claimed to be king of the Jews. This accusation was enough to plant doubt and spark fear of rebellion. Pilate, however, was a cunning and suspicious man. He quickly realized the motivation behind Caiaphas's words and hesitated to grant the request. Pilate's own interactions with Jesus left him intrigued. Here was a calm man who did not beg for his life, but spoke of a kingdom not of this world. Still, pressure from Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin was incessant. They knew that for Pilate, keeping the peace was essential to preserving his position before Caesar. The Sanhedrin, led by Caiaphas, manipulated the situation masterfully. They played on Pilate's fear, insinuating that, by releasing Jesus, he would be colluding with a rebel against Rome. This strategy reached its peak when they threatened to denounce him to the emperor as an accomplice in treason. Pilate, although reluctant, relented. He washed his hands in a symbolic gesture, but authorized the crucifixion, making it clear that the weight of that decision was not his. And so, Caiaphas got what he wanted, or at least it seemed so. The plan he had orchestrated with such precision was unfolding exactly as planned. But would it really be a victory? Or was he heading towards an outcome he could never have predicted? The crucifixion of Jesus was for Caiaphas the culmination of a carefully planned plan. When the people gathered at Golgotha to watch the tragic spectacle, the high priest believed he had secured order. The cross, an instrument of humiliation and death, was also the symbol of Caiaphas's apparent victory. For him, eliminating Jesus meant eradicating a threat that could inflame the people and put the fragile political balance at risk. But did this victory really bring him peace? As Jesus agonized, Caiaphas probably felt momentary relief, believing that everything would return to normal. The crowd would disperse, the Romans would be appeased, and the temple would remain intact. However, there was something disturbing about the way Jesus faced death. His words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," echoed as a stark contrast to the hatred Caiaphas harbored. That act of mercy, even in the midst of pain, planted silent doubts that would germinate over time. In the eyes of Caiaphas, the crucifixion should be the end of the story, but what he couldn't predict was the impact this death would have. Popular commotion grew, rumors of resurrection began to circulate, and Jesus' followers did not disappear as expected. Instead, they seemed more determined, spreading a message of hope that defied the logic of a leader accustomed to control. What was supposed to be a solution became the beginning of a much bigger problem. Caiaphas, at that moment, believed he had won. But the truth was that he had become part of something that would transcend time and space. The cross he thought was the symbol of his victory began to transform into a beacon of resistance and faith. And so, Caiaphas's supposed victory began to reveal its cracks, paving the way for events that would rock his world. The dawn of the third day brought a mystery that would shake the foundations of the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas himself. When the soldiers assigned to guard Jesus' tomb reported that it was empty, the bewilderment was instantaneous. The tomb, sealed and guarded, was now open. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. Jesus had risen, exactly as he had prophesied. For Caiaphas, chaos was inevitable. He, who had controlled every detail until then, now faced the unpredictable. The Sanhedrin met hastily, and the atmosphere was tense. Accusations flew back and forth, and natural explanations failed to quell the unrest. Had the disciples stolen the body? Or was what that man said about overcoming death true? Caiaphas, aware of the devastating impact this news would have, proposed bribing the guards to spread a lie. Jesus' body had been stolen during the night. It was a desperate measure, but he believed the narrative could contain the explosion of faith that threatened to emerge. But rumors of resurrection continued to grow, reaching not just Jerusalem, but surrounding towns and villages. Jesus' once fearful followers now spoke boldly. They claimed to have seen the Master alive, proclaiming that death had been defeated. For Caiaphas, this was more than a spiritual threat. It was a political crisis. How to keep the people under control when many were beginning to believe that he had condemned the Son of God. And so, the apparent order that Caiaphas had tried to preserve began to disintegrate. The resurrection of Jesus was not just a curiosity of history. It was the beginning of a global transformation. And at the center of it all was Caiaphas, a man who, no matter how hard he tried, could not stop the movement he himself had triggered. With rumors of Jesus' resurrection spreading like a whirlwind, Caiaphas faced a new reality. The followers of the one he believed he had silenced were more determined than ever. The apostles preached with courage, attracting crowds and converting hearts. For the high priest, this was unacceptable. He saw this movement as a direct threat to the Sanhedrin's control and the stability he had fought so hard to preserve. Thus, Caiaphas decided to act ruthlessly, starting one of the first persecutions against Christians. The disciples were summoned to the Sanhedrin and faced with accusations of blasphemy and rebellion. Among them, Peter and John, who boldly declared that it was impossible not to speak about what they had seen and heard. The apostles' response not only infuriated Caiaphas, but revealed the scale of the challenge he faced. They did not fear arrest, threats, or even death. For them, the resurrection was irrefutable proof that they were on the right path, and it strengthened their faith in the face of adversity. Stephen's martyrdom marked a turning point in this conflict. Stephen, full of faith and courage, was stoned on the orders of the Sanhedrin, while Caiaphas watched the unfolding. But rather than silencing Christians, his death inspired them to spread Jesus' message even further. In each city they reached, they left seeds of hope that continued to grow, even in the midst of persecution. Caiaphas, try as he might, seemed to be fighting something much bigger than he could comprehend. And so, the Christian movement flourished amid the fire of persecution. Caiaphas believed he was protecting the temple and the law, but perhaps he was unknowingly fulfilling a purpose that escaped his understanding. Did he realize that in his attempt to suffocate the disciples, he was actually fueling a flame that would never go out? The Jerusalem temple was the ultimate symbol of Jewish identity, the beating heart of a people's faith and culture. For Caiaphas, the temple was not just a sacred place. He was also the center of his authority. But the destruction prophesied by Jesus began to unfold before their eyes. Growing dissatisfaction with the Roman occupation and internal tensions between Jewish factions threw the temple into a storm of uncertainty. Caiaphas watched, helplessly, as the prophecy he had so rejected began to be fulfilled. 70 years after Christ, during the Jewish revolt against Rome, the temple was reduced to ruins. What was once majestic, covered in gold and full of life, has become a pile of rubble. For the Jews, it was an unimaginable tragedy. For Christians, a confirmation that Jesus' words had power. The destruction not only marked the end of an era, but also shattered Caiaphas' legacy. The man who had fought to protect the temple saw his efforts turn to dust. The political and religious tensions that culminated in the destruction of the temple were not just external. The division between Pharisees, Sadducees, and Zealots also contributed to the fall. Caiaphas, throughout his life, tried to balance these conflicts, but the weight of the system was greater than he could bear. His alliance with Rome, which had once seemed strategic, was now seen as a fatal mistake. The disillusioned people began to look beyond the Sanhedrin for answers, and the Christian movement continued to grow amidst the chaos. The ruin of the temple was more than the destruction of a building. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another. For Caiaphas, this represented the collapse of everything he had fought for. But did he, when looking at the ashes, understand that he was part of something bigger? Or have you remained trapped by the weight of your own choices, without realizing that the story does not end with destruction, but with the hope of a new beginning? The fall of Caiaphas began silently, like a receding tide before a storm. For years he had enjoyed a position of power as high priest, supported by his political skill and his ties to Rome. However, as the winds of history changed, his authority began to be questioned. The destruction of the temple and the growth of the Christian movement called into question everything it represented. Rome, which had previously supported him, began to see in him a weakened leader incapable of controlling his own people. Caiaphas' removal from office was inevitable. In a symbolic gesture, the Roman Empire appointed another priest, making it clear that its influence had come to an end. The Sanhedrin, which had once obeyed his orders, now saw him as a figure from the past. His loss of power was not just political, it was also spiritual. For someone who held such a high position, being removed was a public humiliation and a personal blow that would echo for the rest of his life. Without the title of high priest, Caiaphas slowly disappeared from the political and religious scene. He, who had decided the fate of so many, was now just a shadow. His life after the fall is shrouded in mystery, but tradition suggests he faced years of isolation and rejection. Some apocryphal reports indicate that he lived tormented by guilt, haunted by the decisions he made while in power. True or not, it is difficult to imagine that he escaped, unscathed from the echoes of the choices that defined his story. And so, the man who had fought to protect his position and the temple ended up as a symbol of defeat and fragility. But did he, looking back at the past, recognize the weight of his actions? Or did he continue to believe that everything he did was justified in the name of peace? The fall of Caiaphas reminds us that power is fleeting, and that decisions made in the search for stability can be the very agents of our downfall. Caiaphas's death remains shrouded in mystery, but it is impossible to ignore the shadows that surround the end of his life. The man who once wielded so much authority met a fate marked by rumors of guilt and regret. Some reports suggest that he lived his final years consumed by incessant anguish, as if the weight of the decisions he made while he was high priest haunted him until his last breath. For someone who dedicated his life to the temple and the law, the divine silence that surrounded his final days must have been unbearable. There are apocryphal traditions that describe a tragic ending, with Caiaphas plunged into solitude and a kind of self-imposed exile. He would have moved away from Jerusalem, unable to face the gaze of a people who were beginning to venerate the one he had helped to crucify. Other, darker stories tell of a death marked by torment, almost as if he had been punished by an invisible judgment. Be that as it may, the fact that his name has become synonymous with betrayal and injustice is a reflection of how history has judged him. Modern archaeologists believe they have found Caiaphas's ossuary in Jerusalem, a small limestone coffin containing his remains. The discovery, in addition to being a historical curiosity, brought up discussions about the authenticity and symbolism of his life. A man who occupied such a high position ended his days in a simple vessel, like any other. It reminds us that regardless of the power we possess, we all face the same fate. And so, Caiaphas's death is more than an endpoint in his story. It is a reminder of the consequences of our choices. Did he, in his final moments, reflect on the impact of his decisions? Or did he leave without ever understanding that his actions were part of a plan much bigger than he could have imagined? Perhaps his death, like his life, is destined to remain an enigma, a symbol of power, tragedy, and redemption. Caiaphas, a historical figure already shrouded in controversy, did not escape also being the center of countless legends and traditions that emerged over the centuries. Some of them paint him as a tormented man, haunted by visions of Jesus' trial, while others portray him as someone who tried unsuccessfully to seek redemption. Apocryphal stories report that he would have experienced moments of intense guilt, crying out for forgiveness from the God he had represented throughout his life. True or not, these narratives show how his figure remained alive in the Christian imagination. In some Christian traditions, Caiaphas is compared to Judas Iscariot, both carrying the burden of having contributed to the crucifixion. However, while Judas is remembered for his extreme repentance, which culminated in his death, Caiaphas is described as someone who would have faced slower but equally ruthless divine justice. These stories suggest that he was punished for his arrogance and abuse of power, living a life of torment before meeting his end. It is a curiosity of history that so many efforts were made to fill the voids left by his trajectory. Other legends revolve around his possible conversion to Christianity. Some traditions suggest that Caiaphas, upon witnessing the growth of the movement started by Jesus, recognized that his actions contributed to something much greater than he could understand. These accounts, although rare, bring a different perspective, suggesting that even history's greatest villains can find redemption. It is a powerful theme which echoes the message of forgiveness present in Jesus' teachings. Regardless of the veracity of these legends, they reflect the lasting impact of the figure of Caiaphas on Christian culture and faith. He is not only remembered as the high priest who condemned Jesus, but as a symbol of the complexities of power, faith, and the consequences of our choices. Do the legends about him tell us more about who he was, or about the human desire to find justice and meaning in the stories of the past? The discovery of Caiaphas's tomb was one of the most fascinating archaeological finds of the 20th century, bringing to light a concrete piece of history. In 1990, a decorated limestone ossuary was found in Jerusalem, bearing the inscription, "Joseph, son of Caiaphas." This identification, considered authentic by many experts, provided a physical connection to one of the most controversial characters in the New Testament. For scholars and those curious about history, it was like opening a window to the past. The ossuary, simple in its essence, contrasted with the power and position that Caiaphas had occupied. He, who had commanded the Sanhedrin and negotiated with Rome, was buried modestly, without the exuberant signs of grandeur that could be expected from someone of his position. This discovery not only humanized the figure of Caiaphas, but also raised questions about how he was viewed in his time. Could it be that, in the end, even he faced a kind of ostracism, being relegated to history in such a silent way? Analysis of the remains found in the ossuary brought even more intriguing details. Studies indicate that the bones belong to a man around 60 years old, an advanced age for the period in which he lived. This fact reinforces the idea that he had a long life, which contrasts with the early death of many of his contemporaries, marked by conflicts and persecution. However, the lack of records about his final years continues to fuel theories and debates about how he lived after losing his position as high priest. For Christians and scholars, the tomb of Caiaphas is not just an artifact. It is a symbol of the complexities of your life and the impact of your actions. He represents the meeting of faith, power, and history, reminding us that the greatest characters of an era, no matter how controversial, eventually become just names set in stone. And so, the discovery of the tomb invites us to reflect. Did he imagine that centuries later, he would still be such a debated figure? The figure of Caiaphas continues to divide opinions to this day. Was he a villain, driven by greed and the need to maintain control? Or was it just a piece in the divine plan, whose role was necessary for the redemption of humanity? His decision to condemn Jesus was undoubtedly fraught with political and religious implications. Yet at the same time, it paved the way for the most transformative events in Christian history. This duality makes Caiaphas an enigma, a leader who, even without intention, fulfilled a greater purpose. For many, Caiaphas represents the dark side of power. He symbolizes the figure of a leader who, in the name of stability, sacrificed justice. By tearing his clothes at Jesus' trial, he not only condemned an innocent man, but also revealed his own fragility in the face of something he did not understand. However, their participation can also be seen as a fulfillment of Scripture. Jesus would need to be handed over, judged and crucified for God's plan to be complete. Thus, even Caiaphas's cruelest acts seem to have been orchestrated by something greater. This vision gives rise to an even deeper reflection. To what extent are our actions really under our control? Caiaphas believed he was protecting his nation, preserving peace, and fulfilling his duty. But what if he was just an instrument of a higher will? The idea that even the story's villains have a role in the unfolding of something great is a curiosity of history that invites us to look beyond the surface. After all, the line between heroes and villains is often determined by the context and consequences of their choices. And so, the story of Caiaphas challenges us to reevaluate the concept of guilt and purpose. Was he just a man trying to protect his world? Or was his destiny already written before he even made his choices? Perhaps in the end, Caiaphas is yet another reflection of the complexity of the human condition, where good and evil intertwine to form the fabric of history. Caiaphas's influence continued to resonate far beyond his lifetime, especially in the early church. To early Christians, he represented more than a high priest. He was the symbol of a system that rejected the Messiah himself. In the Acts of the Apostles, the name of Caiaphas appears as a constant reminder of the barriers faced by Jesus' followers. He, who had led the Sanhedrin at the trial of Christ, was also one of the first to orchestrate the persecution of those who dared to proclaim the resurrection. The disciples, however, were not intimidated. The courage of men like Peter and John, who faced Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin to declare their faith, inspired others to join the Christian movement. Even under threats, they continued to preach, expanding Jesus' message beyond the borders of Jerusalem. Ironically, Caiaphas's effort to silence the apostles only strengthened the movement, turning resistance into a catalyst for church growth. Caiaphas's name, which he hoped would be associated with the order, became a reminder of the unshakable faith of the early Christians. Furthermore, the figure of Caiaphas helped shape the theology of the early church. He was often cited as an example of the conflict between earthly and divine authority. To early Christians, their actions demonstrated that even those in positions of power can be blinded by their own ambitions. This narrative reinforced the idea that the kingdom of God was something beyond human structures, a lesson that was echoed in sermons, letters, and writings of the time. Thus, while Caiaphas sought to erase Jesus' message, he ended up helping it reach the world. Their opposition, rather than destroying the movement, revealed the strength of a faith that could not be contained. Did he, in his last days, realize that he had helped build what he tried so hard to destroy? Or has his legacy as an antagonist remained a bitter irony in a story that continues to transform lives to this day? Caiaphas's actions, seen from a spiritual perspective, carry a weight that transcends time. He, who found himself at the center of such grandiose events, made decisions that shaped not only his time, but all of Christian history. Sentencing Jesus to death may seem at first glance to be an act of ambition and fear. However, for many theologians, Caiaphas was not just a political leader trying to protect his world. He was an instrument, conscious or not, of a divine plan. His choices, so human in their motivations, ended up fulfilling prophecies that went back centuries. There is something deeply paradoxical about his role. Caiaphas believed he was defending the order and sanctity of the temple, but his actions opened the way for a new alliance between God and humanity. He tore his clothes in outrage during Jesus' trial, but symbolically, it was he who helped tear the veil of the temple, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The spiritual meaning of his actions goes beyond man. It represents the tension between what we understand as earthly power and what we call eternal purpose. To reflect on Caiaphas, it is necessary to recognize the complexity of the human heart. How many times have we found ourselves, like him, acting in the name of something greater, but motivated by our own fears and insecurities? Just as he tried to preserve what he thought was right, we too often resist changes that can transform us. This is a curiosity about Caiaphas's story. It forces us to look inside and question to what extent we are truly aligned with what we believe. And so, the spiritual significance of Caiaphas lies not just in what he did, but in what he represents. He reminds us that even the most controversial acts can be part of something bigger. Did he understand this in the last days of his life? Or did his role as a key player in God's plan remain a mystery until the end? Perhaps this is the greatest lesson of its history. The divine purpose does not depend on human understanding, but always finds a way to be fulfilled. The psychology of Caiaphas, especially in relation to guilt, is interesting and often overlooked territory. The man who had the power to decide on Jesus' life in his hands probably never imagined the weight that this decision would have on his soul. By condemning Jesus, Caiaphas was not only taking a political stance, but also a spiritual one. He believed he was doing what was necessary to preserve order, but the profound dissonance between his actions and God's purpose must have later echoed in his conscience. Guilt, like an invisible weight, may have been a constant in his final years. They say that guilt is not just limited to regret for an action, but to the recognition that we have somehow acted against our own morality or purpose. For Caiaphas, the decision to hand over Jesus was more than a political action. It was a violation of what he was supposed to protect: justice and truth. The psychology of guilt shows us that often the greatest torment we face does not come from the external consequences of our actions, but from the internal echo that these actions cause in our consciences. Caiaphas may have been a man surrounded by large crowds and filled with authority, but the spiritual loneliness he may have faced following his decision could have been his greatest punishment. The concept of guilt is also related to power. Caiaphas, as a religious leader, was a central figure in the Sanhedrin and throughout the Jewish authority structure. However, power also brings with it a burden: the responsibility to make decisions that affect other people's lives. The psychology of guilt suggests that the greater the responsibility, the heavier the guilt becomes when actions lead to a painful end. Caiaphas, who had been so resolute in his actions, was perhaps consumed by the guilt growing in the hearts of the leaders. The doubt that he could have acted differently probably didn't leave him alone. The psychology of guilt also teaches us that, in many cases, pain doesn't just come from what we did, but from what we didn't do. Caiaphas may have wondered over the years whether he had made an irreparable mistake in condemning Jesus. And as the world around him continued to change, with Christianity growing by leaps and bounds, did he wonder about his part in what, for many, was the greatest story of redemption ever told? His guilt would not only be about the death of Jesus, but about the life he could have preserved. The figure of Caiaphas transcended the limits of history and was immortalized in art and popular culture in different ways, generating interpretations and representations that continue to resonate to this day. In paintings, plays, films, and literature, he is often portrayed as the archetypal villain who acts in the name of morality, but whose actions result in tragedy. The image of Caiaphas, with his priestly robes and rigid expression, symbolizes not only religious authority, but also the rigidity of a system that rejects the new in the name of tradition. His posture, often carrying a serious and threatening appearance, makes him a figure that arouses, at the same time, fascination and repulsion. In Christian art, Caiaphas appears as the antagonist par excellence, the leader who, in his zeal for the law, condemns the Messiah to death. His figure is often used to illustrate the tension between the old and the new, between the old covenant and the new grace that Jesus brought to the world. The moment of his indignation at Jesus' trial is commonly represented in a dramatic way, emphasizing his direct responsibility for Christ's condemnation. Historical paintings and sculptures, such as those by Renaissance artists, transformed Caiaphas into a symbol of guilt, excessive authority, and lack of spiritual vision. On the other hand, in modern films and plays, Caiaphas continues to be a controversial figure. In many of these depictions, he is not just a one-dimensional villain, but a man tormented by his own choices. In cinemas, the character is often portrayed as someone who, no matter how hard he tries to justify himself, ends up falling into a moral dilemma, where his actions distance him further and further from what would be a fair leader. This more human, more complex portrayal explores Caiaphas's flaws in a way that makes him more relatable to modern audiences. From a villain to a man lost in his own beliefs, Caiaphas is a figure who serves as a mirror of the power choices everyone faces. And so, popular culture continues to shape and reinterpret Caiaphas, giving him new layers and meanings. He is not only the priest who betrayed his own mission, but also a symbol of the difficulties that arise when power structures become more important than the truth. The stories, films, and plays that explore his figure invite us to reflect on our own relationship with power and truth. Caiaphas, therefore, remains a timeless figure whose mistakes and dilemmas still reverberate in the heart of contemporary culture. The relationship between religion and power has always been complex, and the story of Caiaphas is a clear reflection of this dynamic. In the 1st century, the high priest was not only a spiritual leader, but also a powerful political figure, representing the interests of the Jewish people before the Roman Empire. Caiaphas, when occupying this position, was at the center of a delicate balance of power, where the decisions he made could mean the survival of his nation or its destruction. Its history teaches us that when religion is instrumentalized to maintain power, the consequences can be disastrous. Throughout history, we have often seen religious leaders approaching political power, creating alliances that compromise their spiritual mission. The search for political stability and the desire for control can eventually distort the fundamental principles of the faith. Caiaphas, in his quest to protect the temple and its authority, did just that. He sacrificed truth and justice in the name of preserving a system he believed was essential to the survival of his people. However, their actions reveal that when power is prioritized over ethics and spiritual truth, what should be a path of light becomes a labyrinth of darkness. The story of Caiaphas also serves as a warning to all of us about the dangers of putting power first. When religion becomes just a tool for maintaining privileges, contact with the essence of what is truly sacred is lost. Caiaphas, in condemning Jesus, represented a system that feared the change and true renewal that Jesus preached. His story is a lesson that power, when poorly administered, not only corrupts, but also prevents the flourishing of true faith. The reflection that this story proposes to us is profound. Where are we allowing religion and power to become confused in our own lives? Are we seeking the collective good or trying to stay in control of our own beliefs and convictions? Caiaphas's mistake was not only in betraying his own spiritual mission, but also in allowing political power to govern his perception of truth. And so, the story of Caiaphas teaches us that true faith must be free from any manipulation, and that it is only when we put the truth above all things that we can see the divine light. The story of Caiaphas and Judas is, without a doubt, one of the most complex and intriguing in the Christian tradition. Both played central roles in the condemnation of Jesus, but they did so in different ways and for reasons that, at first glance, seem opposite. Judas, the traitor, acted for personal reasons, perhaps greed, disillusionment, or desperation. Caiaphas, on the other hand, acted in the name of religion and politics, believing he was defending the stability of his people and the temple. However, both, in different ways, committed Jesus to suffering, becoming figures of betrayal in biblical history. Judas's betrayal is widely seen as a personal moral failing. He was one of the 12 disciples, someone who walked with Jesus, heard his teachings, and saw miracles. However, for 30 pieces of silver, he betrayed his master, an act of pure betrayal. For many, Judas is the symbol of the sin of betrayal, motivated by selfish human desires. His guilt is manifest, and, unlike Caiaphas, there is no great justification for his action. He was someone who had a direct relationship with Jesus, but chose to follow the path of disloyalty and hopelessness. Caiaphas, as a religious and political leader, saw his betrayal from a different perspective. For him, the elimination of Jesus was not just an act of betrayal, but a strategic action to preserve what he believed to be order. He did so not for personal gain, but out of a deep conviction that Jesus represented a threat to the status quo, both religiously and politically. However, this distorted view of good led him to commit an even more complicated act, sacrificing an innocent man to ensure the maintenance of his power. Caiaphas's betrayal, therefore, was more ideological but equally destructive. Thus, Judas and Caiaphas, although motivated by different reasons, share the same responsibility for an act that would change the destiny of all humanity. Judas betrayed with a kiss, but Caiaphas betrayed with a sentence. Both were crucial players in the outcome of Jesus' crucifixion, but their motivations and the effects of their actions differ. This invites us to reflect. To what extent can our choices, whether impulsive or calculated, lead us to betray what is sacred in our lives? And can we learn to make choices that are more aligned with truth and the greater good by looking at their story? The story of Caiaphas, although buried in the past, remains of profound and disturbing relevance today. His actions and decisions represent a powerful reminder of the choices we all make when facing power, authority, and truth. In a world where power structures still dominate and ethical decisions are often made in the name of a higher order, the figure of Caiaphas remains a mirror of the difficulties we all face when faced with moral and political dilemmas. His story forces us to question, to what extent are we willing to sacrifice principles in the name of maintaining our own conveniences or status? In modern times, we can see many Caiaphas around us, leaders who make difficult choices, sometimes in the name of the collective good, but who get lost in the traps of power. In political, business, or even family contexts, the fear of losing control or security can lead us to make decisions that compromise our integrity. Like Caiaphas, many in positions of authority find themselves forced to choose between keeping the peace and following the truth. And often, the price paid for these choices is high. The story of Caiaphas is not just that of an ancient man, it is an eternal warning about the dangers of power when it is used without a genuine commitment to truth and justice. Furthermore, the way Caiaphas dealt with Jesus, ignoring the greater good in the name of preserving the system, also resonates with the dilemmas of our age. In a world where social conformity and convention often dictate the behavior of individuals and groups, Caiaphas serves as a reminder of how faith, justice, and truth can be distorted to suit selfish interests. Like him, many find themselves in situations where the truth seems to be an obstacle to what they consider to be more important, be it maintaining order, stability, or control. However, the tragedy of Caiaphas shows us that this type of decision not only destroys authenticity, but also takes us away from a greater purpose. The relevance of Caiaphas in today's world lies in how his actions invite us to reflect on the use of power and authority. Are we being guided by unquestionable principles, or are we becoming prisoners of fear and convenience? Like Caiaphas, many of us still face decisive moments where choosing between what is easy and what is right can change the course of our lives. The real lesson from her story is the importance of holding firm to core values, even when it challenges us to question the norms around us. In the Gospels, Caiaphas is portrayed in a unique way, with emphasis on his position as the religious and political leader of Jerusalem. His figure appears mainly in the context of Jesus' trial, where his authority is central, but is also shown in moments of frustration, doubt, and hostility. The evangelist's view of Caiaphas is multifaceted and nuanced. In the accounts, he is the man who orchestrates Jesus' condemnation, showing himself to be relentless in his search for justice, or, more precisely, for maintaining the status quo. He is not just judging a man, but challenging the divine flow of events itself. In the Gospels, especially in Matthew and Mark, Caiaphas is the archetypal religious leader who acts in the name of morality, but who, in doing so, compromises the truth. During Jesus' trial, Caiaphas, enraged by Jesus' answer to his question about being the Christ, tears his clothes as a sign of blasphemy. This symbolic gesture, in addition to highlighting his religious pride and attachment to tradition, reflects an attempt to impose his vision of justice on God's plan. The condemnation that Caiaphas imposes on Jesus is not only political but also theological, showing how, in his mind, the need to protect the Jewish faith and the social order surpassed any notion of mercy. However, the vision in the Gospels also reveals Caiaphas's vulnerability. The confrontation with Jesus, who remains calm and serene in the face of all the accusations, makes him appear powerless, trapped in a web of expectations and fears. In its most dramatic moments, the Gospel of John emphasizes that Caiaphas, in stating that it was better for a man to die for the people, was inadvertently fulfilling a prophetic purpose. This irony, present in the Gospels, suggests that despite his treacherous actions, Caiaphas was part of a greater plan, which he himself did not understand. And so, in the evangelical accounts, Caiaphas appears as a tragic figure, fighting to preserve the system he believed to be correct, but without realizing that in doing so, he was fighting against the divine plan itself. The narrative in the Gospels, when presenting Caiaphas, invites us to reflect on how human actions, often driven by fear and the need for control, can be part of a much greater and mysterious purpose. This leads us to the question: at what moments in our lives are we acting like Caiaphas, trying to force our view of reality without realizing God's great plan at work around us? The story of Caiaphas is, without a doubt, one of the most complex and multifaceted in the Bible. He is remembered as the man who, in the name of preserving a religious and political system, made the decision to condemn Jesus to death. However, his story goes beyond his betrayal. She offers us profound lessons about power, faith, and the search for truth. Caiaphas, with his elevated position and cruel actions, exemplifies human frailty in the face of the pressures of a chaotic world, where the need for control and the preservation of the status quo often obscure the true divine purpose. In the end, Caiaphas became a symbol of the consequences of acting without a broader vision. His attempt to silence Jesus, maintain order and protect the temple, ended up not only failing, but generating a movement that would transform history forever. Caiaphas's legacy is, therefore, a paradox. He is remembered as the high priest who tried to eradicate the message of Jesus, but in doing so unwittingly helped to spread it further. Jesus' death, which he helped orchestrate, became the centerpiece of a new era, an era where grace, mercy, and truth would prevail over the rigidity and corruption of power. The story of Caiaphas also challenges us to reflect on our own choices. As leaders in our spheres of influence, whether at work, family, or society, how do we act when faced with what is fair and what is appropriate? Could it be that, in our own moments of decision, we are not in some way repeating the mistakes of Caiaphas? His life, therefore, is not just a story of the past, but a mirror that reflects our own attitudes toward truth and power. And so, Caiaphas's legacy lives on, not just as a historical warning, but as a profound reflection on what it means to lead, judge, and, above all, understand divine designs. Her story reminds us that no matter how hard we try to control the course of events, there is a larger plan at work, and often we are just pieces on a board that we cannot fully understand.
If you're interested in having a Bible like the one we use in our studies, check out the link in the first pinned comment. If you enjoy our content and can support our channel, consider buying us a coffee through Buy Me a Coffee. Additionally, if you can purchase a crucifix, we also have a link in the first pinned comment. We greatly appreciate your support. God bless, and see you in the next video.